all the speakers talking about the quality of the walks and the motivation that comes from walking something that is mind-blowing, frankly, or spellbinding. And whether it's Parramatta walking along the foreshores there, or whether it's Sydney walking around the new Sydney Harbour and coastal walking interconnected walk around Sydney, it's the quality of the walk that actually initially gets people out. And so what that needs to be, that or in Sydney, is promoted to get people out, and then they are blown away by what they see and experience, whether it's in Sydney, Parramatta, or in a country town. And then, once you're out walking, you're halfway there to walk down to the ferry or to the bus stop or to where you shop, because you've actually experienced it. So the important thing to me, and I'd like you to answer, is motivation and the quality of the walk to get people out initially, to then encourage them to do more.
Okay, who's your question to, or is it?
I think it's to Rod Tolley and to Joe Mitchell to start.
Joe, go ahead.
No pressure. No pressure. Look, I think you're right. I mean, clearly, there are lots of opportunities for walking that aren't taken up, and I think that's sort of one of the things that sort of strikes me, and I mentioned this yesterday when we had a meeting in PCAL, is that there's very clear evidence that people who live close to areas which are, quite beautiful to walk at, so for example on the coastal area of Sydney, for example, have higher rates of walking. Having said that, that's not as accessible to all people. But I'm certainly aware, and probably some of my colleagues from local health districts and also from people at the local area will also have been involved in the promotion of some of those local opportunities through partnerships with local council, for example, on the sorts of opportunities that are available in the local community. So I think that there is an opportunity for doing that, but in some sense that does need to be at a local level as well, although of course there are always going to be some of the key pieces of infrastructure, like for example the foreshore around Sydney Harbour, which will pull people from all over the place, and indeed from international places as well.
Okay, Rodney, so did you want to answer, or?
Just a very quick comment about the issue of legibility and wayfinding, which has been touched on already by Caroline, I think. We don't routinely pay enough attention to that. We all assume we know where to go, but of course that's not true for our visitors from interstate and overseas. So we need those wayfinding marks, we need the signs, we need the maps, we need the structures in place, not cluttering, but just being carefully well designed at critical decision points in a route to make sure that people know where to go. And I think you add that to the needs of people who live in the area as well, to make sure that the opportunities are put in front of them which perhaps they didn't realise. They can see maybe some of the distance, but they can't see the opportunity of the whole route and perhaps how well it's connected. So I think it's really a question of laying out the opportunities to advertise the benefits that you have out there in terms of a walking environment, and also to give people confidence, which I think is really important for your visitors, to know that they're on track, to know that they're going somewhere, to know that there's a seat on the way, or some public toilets on the way, or a resting place. Those kinds of things as part of your wayfinding systems are really critical.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, now we got some hands up. Now there was one from Dick, and I'll go to you two then next. So you get another shot, Dick.
I have a difficult question for Caroline. As we move from a spread out sort of city, car-based city, to a much more compact public transport-based city, we're starting to suffer. My office, GTA Consultants, does a lot of work with both yourselves as well as with developers. And one of the big problems we're coming across is we want to develop much more densely along some of our busy road corridors. And we get letters back from various government agencies, no can do. How can you help us?
Well, I don't know if you're aware, and I don't know if anyone from the Department of Planning is here, but the government, as I mentioned about housing supply earlier, is working very hard to put in place a lot of urban activation precincts along the transport corridors. And we've been working with the Department of Planning. I have a whole team of about 11 people now that are just focusing on how do we actually provide the right connections They get involved in commenting on development proposals and planning proposals to make sure all of the modes are considered. They're looking at interchange planning along those corridors, because as more and more people use them, a lot of our interchanges don't cater for that. We get numerous letters from people talking about, well, the bicycle facilities are, 400 metres from the actual interchange facility, and they're not secure. So we're working very closely with the Department of Planning on those urban activation precincts. And I think there's about 8 of them at this point in time to try and get a better outcome along the transport corridors.
Thank you. So I think, we don't have someone from planning here, and that it would be helpful in that kind of conversation. And so I would take your comments and I noted. But Peter, did you want to say anything?
Just an additional comment that Walk 21 provides an opportunity for us to focus on that and how we might do that, and that we could have a particular focus on urban design to encourage greater walking around those urban activation precincts. And it's a simple example of how we can use Walk 21 and all of that international expertise to get some ideas.
Yep, thank you. Great. All right, so there was a yes, and then...
Sorry. Romilly, clearly you live in the people...
Sorry, could you just identify yourself so that...
I know who he is.
I'm about to.
Yeah.
You clearly live in the People's Republic of Pittwater, commonly known in the Northern Beaches as Pittwater. I'm the Mayor of Warringah, Michael Regan, and we're spending about $10 million on building a walking track around Narrabeen Lagoon, which is fabulous multi-use.
Brilliant. I've run it.
Yeah, and you'll be able to basically ride your bike also from Narrabeen all the way to Tiwai Beach, which is fabulous. But my question is, both yourself and Carolyn, you've got the hardest job in government, no question. You do a fantastic job from all reports. But you keep talking about partnerships. What does that actually mean for us? What does it meaningfully at a local government level? What is a partnership? Because we're about to spend $30–40 million on developing ZY, and walking and tracks like that is very important to us, and making it pedestrian friendly. I was just saying to staff, we've got 3,000 car parks planned, a little part of ZY there, and that's just, is that a bit over the top? Given what we've said at the very beginning, slides type thing, and I guess what is the idea of a partnership? You have a very hard job and you're very hard to get a hold of. How do we become a priority? Because Barangaroo and other things are a big priority for all of Sydney. Warringah is just one little part. What is the definition of partnership, and how can we be a priority on your radar and do the work for you?
Okay, good question.
Is that for me?
Well, I think it's for both of us.
Yeah.
Well, I'll give you an example on the industry side. If you look at the Narrabeen shops, that area where that walkway is, you'd be working with those areas about activation, which you do. Like there's great markets there and so on and so forth. But I'll give you an international example of what to do and then what not to do. So High Line in New York, and if no one knows about it, you should look it online, is an old railway line that goes through the top, goes through the buildings of New York, and they were going to rip it down, and a whole lot of community people got together, and it's a walkway between buildings. And they did a partnership between a community group with the New York City and with the people who own buildings along there to activate that space. And the values of those spaces has, markedly increased. But it's where you all get together for the same aim of activating spaces, because around that Narrabeen area, which is good, could be even better. And so it's working with the local community and the shop owners on, well, what do you want in your area to get more people to come to that Narrabeen area so that they are riding their bikes and they're buying their sandwiches there and so on and so forth. So we would see that as a partnership where you get the local, like you guys, the industry and the shop owners together in working out what's the best for that area. And you might have already done that. I'm just saying that that's how we would classify a partnership. And I do take on board your point about Barangaroo. We get that a lot. Everyone goes, it's all about Barangaroo. But what about all these other communities in New South Wales? So thank you for reminding me, because I should be more cognizant of that.
All right, Carolyn, did you want to make a response?
Well, we work with councils in partnership in a lot of ways. We do funding partnerships, and we have funding set aside in our budget to work on jointly funded projects. We work on local planning to get joint planning outcomes. We're doing a lot of work actually around car parks. We actually promote park and ride, particularly because people often walk and that when they get to the other end. And I mentioned the issue of having a lot of things around cycling and around interchanges, but also around car parks. We work also in partnership with councils on things such as access to land. If we want to make some differences and improve, access for active living, often it's access to land, and maybe council land or state land, or we can actually work together to try and overcome some of those barriers. We're doing a really good partnership at the moment with Parramatta City Council. on some cycling things. A lot of other councils as well, so we'd be happy to come and talk to you.
Right, all right, thank you. And the lady in the yellow top, yeah.
Dr. Julie Himo, I'm an urban planner and landscape architect. Sydney's a series of nodes, and most of Sydney doesn't use the CBD on a weekly basis. So this is a question actually to Transport New South Wales. And I've got a question about one particular node, and that's the Sutherland Urban Centre. And the question is, how did you come up with the design and the process for the current interchange, which restricts permeability and movement for the local communities around that? And secondly, the process for planning a 3-storey commuter car park in what is potentially quite an important potential urban area where people could live rather than park the cars. But here we are talking about permeability, urban design, connectivity, and one of the most important sites that was potentially available for development is likely to go to a commuter car park, so it's not just a park and ride. And earlier work that had been done back in 2002 demonstrated that the existing interchange had actually had people drive from further away to park at that new commuter car park, didn't actually attract new commuters.
Okay, so this is a highly specific example here we're talking about, isn't it? So it may not be fair to put that question completely.
I'd like to know all about this one, but I won't go into in detail.
But you might like to answer in general terms.
One of the things there is when we did the consultations with the Sutherland area, the two things that came up loudest at that community consultation was the need for more car parking so people could get onto public transport, and more cycling facilities. We're also looking at a rail corridor feasibility study at the moment about more cycling down the utilising the rail corridor. There are issues around that parking. We're working with the council through those, but I'm happy to talk to you about what's going on there in more detail after this session.
Okay, so we had one hand here and we've got one hand here. So you here first, Nick?
My name is Nick Chapman. I'm the Greenway Place Manager, which also follows the line of the Inner West Light Rail. And if anybody's interested, the light rail is due to opening in the next 5 or 6 weeks, and you'll be able to go from Lilyfield all the way to Dulwich Hill along 9 new light rail stops. But I guess my question relates to priorities, because it's all about where do we prioritise the money, either at state government level or local government level. It's primarily directed at Caroline, but the other panel members might like to make a comment. I guess I'd like to suggest that finally, in the 21st century, we are seeing a major investment in light rail. Its success will depend on the extent to which the surrounding areas between 400 and 800 metres either side of the light rail stops are safe and attractive for pedestrians during the day and at night. The position that I occupy is funded by 4 councils. We are very keen to partner with the state government, not just in terms of the immediate area along the corridor, but the walking precinct either side. And I'd be interested in your comments on that.
Well, there's been a long issue which we've been discussing for quite a while around the Greenway. I mean, certainly good connections to some of these new public transport modes are going to be key. We are doing a lot of planning for that, and the issue around priorities is a tough one for us. I mean, I was boasting earlier that for the first time we now have clear line items for cycling and walking as specific individual line items in my capital budget. Well, that wasn't there before I started 2.5 years ago, but there's only so much funding available. So what we are trying to do is to look at areas in terms of levels of demand. We are trying to look at areas in terms of connection to existing public transport modes. And some of that planning hasn't kept up to speed, so we are trying to get that planning rushed through and continuing to work with communities on, you know, what they see as their priorities, but also whether we can, as I mentioned earlier, partnership with councils and others to try and accelerate some of those outcomes, particularly if there's a contribution towards funding.
Okay, thank you. All right, there's hand up there.
Glenn Mabley, I come from the Western Sydney Local Health District. If I went 2 inches up the top of that map, I'd see where I work. So it's right there on that map. I work in innovation and redesign as a senior medical advisor. In that patch we have, and going a bit west of that, we have 3 times the prevalence of diabetes. We've got 3 times more chance of getting diabetes than if you were in Bungaroo or in the inner city. So we have a real problem of a huge I would like to think more how we can now get this out into the next steps of where we might be working, and certainly in the health sector in Western Sydney. We're really interested in working with council and with others because we have a huge, we can't wait for incremental change. We have to come for transformational change because we are actually being very overrun in our patch because of the solutions that have been talked about today. So really going to Pete Cowell and the group up there is how can we take this conversation, this action, and put it on the map that I can see in front of me.
Right, now, Peter, do you want to start with that? Yep.
The intent, thanks, Glenn, and you've run excellent events just like this, gathering similar multi-agency crowd often, and it's great. The intention of today is exactly what you've highlighted, to bring a range of different agencies, industry, local council case study, which I thought was excellent. It's great in terms of presenting the possibilities. To then provide that state context, and it's a perfect, the intention was to then say, we've got all of these potential levers to then implement this work, but it's really obviously going to have to happen at the local council level and within those regional areas is going to be the application of what was presented today in terms of the strategic context. So that's really that next step, is implementing that, what we've managed to be able to achieve since the last meeting, this same gathering last year. There's been some significant achievements from a policy and legislative context, or almost a legislative context. And really now what we're trying to do is make sure that that just doesn't hang there and that we just put it as a bookmark, that it actually gets applied into practice. And I suppose it's the translation of those policy documents into practice, which we'd hopefully be highlighting next year with case studies like we've seen with Parramatta.
And Katie, did you have a comment about this? I mean, it's not necessarily your turf, but...
Well, I would... I actually work in city strategy at Parramatta, and you might think I'm a bit of a zealot when I say this, but we have economic, environmental and social people doing strategies, and it's a really dynamic crowd to work with. And sometimes and it's fantastic to have a strategy and a policy, but I also, my view is that these things happen, but people often at council don't pay much attention to them. I mean, it's a terrible thing to say, and they just keep on doing what they keep on doing. And so you do need the strategy. Like, I'm a firm believer in strategy and design and ideas. But I also think that you have to look at what is actually happening out there and look at engaging with those projects that are happening at that time to work with what's being done on the ground. And by that I mean, we have, for instance, money gets given to transport section every year, and they do little bits of footpath upgrade or little bits of road upgrade. And so part of the idea of Design Parramatta was to kind of do, just from a purely conceptual level, to do a whole vision. So whenever they're doing their little things, you can say, hang on, don't just put that fence in there. Think about the big picture. We've accepted this. Can you think about it and do it slightly differently? So not always successful, but I do think part of it is creating that vision and then working with the things that are actually happening to change them on the ground.
We would say it's about accountability. And if you have a target and you have to report on it and you know what the issue is, then you can track how you're going. So if you know diabetes is a big issue and your aim is to reduce it by a certain %, you have to measure that. And that's becoming quite common in cities around the world where they know what their issues are, whether it's water quality, access to public transport, whatever it is. Cities are now saying, here is our target, and every year we will independently verify and report on how we're going. And until you get to that stage, strategies are great, and I agree that you need them, but you have to be bolder in having accountability around this is what we want to achieve.
So, Joe...
From the health perspective, as you'd know, Glenn, and connecting back to my presentation, we do have within the service agreements between the ministry and the local health districts indicators key performance indicators in relation to achievement of targets associated with the Healthy Children Initiative, and there's a very clear accountability for that. But as I mentioned before, I mean, certainly there's a local infrastructure to support that work in all of the local health districts, which is really positive, and so I'd really encourage the inclusion of that primary prevention focus within your local work as well, as well as the clinical focus. So we do have those indicators, but as I think has been very neatly demonstrated today, that's really only one, like the health system plays one part in a much broader endeavour. And so, you know, I do agree with Peter that sort of replicating this type of thing, which I know that you're planning to do, is actually a very good strategy to get that local activation with the appropriate stakeholders, which is beyond health.
All right, so we're
Could I just make a
a
quick comment? I mean, very much at the practical level, and it would be impertinent of me as an international blow-in to suggest how you should do this in terms of the expertise that's on the table here. But the arrival of Walk 21 here in Sydney in October, I think, is an advantage, an opportunity for you to take. And it isn't just about telling the rest of the world how good you do things here. It's about saying to the rest of the world, actually, we do have some issues with which we would like to share international advice to actually find out how these things are dealt with elsewhere. And I think, you know, continuing a conversation between you and Peter in particular to make sure that this is an element that is incorporated strongly within the Walk 21 programme for October. As maybe workshops, as maybe an opportunity to bring in expertise from outside to partner with you to see what kind of solutions might be brought in from elsewhere.
Right, so we're going to have one more question, and then I'm going to ask the panel in 10 seconds or 15 seconds or less to say what they would like to see happen next from their perspective. So, Ian, you had the hand up first.
Ian Napier, the convener of the Walking Volunteers. I just wanted to follow up on that last question. The Walking Volunteers up till now have produced a walking network for the metropolitan area that goes as far as the head of the Parramatta River. But we're currently working on a Great West Walk which links with Parramatta with the Blue Mountains. We're in the market for partnerships working with local government and state government to make that vision work, because here is a project that will provide a resource for half of Sydney's population that lives to the west of Parramatta. The environments are there. As someone who lives in the east of Sydney, I'm blown away with some of the walking that is possible there, but it requires the funding for little connections to make this whole thing work. So I'm just putting it out there. We're in the market for partnerships. We're looking for your help.
Okay, so as Tony Jones would say, I'll take that as a comment. Thank you. So we'll wrap up now with just a final sort of 10 to 15 seconds. What would you want to do next? Peter?
See everyone...
Oh, yeah. Switch it up there.
See everyone submit an abstract by March 14th for Walk 21.
Excellent.
And then come along and we can make it make the most of the opportunity.
Thank you.
Look, I think we have an opportunity in relation to some of our existing resources, for example, the Healthy Urban Design Checklist, and so I'd like to see opportunities for us to use that more broadly across a range of sectors.
Mine would be, there's been talk about common metrics, and I think common metrics are really important, but also look at what's being used in other states and territories. What confuses the industry is when every single state and territory uses something different, and that just has an impact on productivity. So try and, if you're going to create something, try and do it at a national approach, so it's common across just not New South Wales, but all the other jurisdictions as well.
Okay.
What I'd like to see is greater promotion by a lot of people, everyone here today, my department, other departments, about the benefits of walking. I think walking makes vibrant communities and it has a lot of other benefits as well. And I think we are, as a society, quite silent on the benefits of walking. So I think the Walk 21 conference provides an opportunity, for example, to hang a whole lot of events and opportunities off the side of that and really start to get the conversation going.
I think that we need to get the information and the ideas that are shared here just more widely understood, and especially by decision makers, because so often what happens is that people can go in there with great ideas and it just gets hijacked by a few people who have these kind of fixed ideas that stop it. And I think, as Rodney was saying, the evidence needs to be explained, and in particular the way that walking and making livable cities is good from environmental, social, and healthy and economic. It has all these benefits, and but it's often not presented like that as this complete package, and that needs to be much, much more broadly understood.
Two things, one mental, one physical. The mental one is just bear in mind the connection between livability and walkability. The 5 top livable cities in the world are all great walkable cities, and Sydney's in an international competition for inward investment and for creative people, and if it isn't a great walkable city, it won't achieve as well as it could do. That's the mental thing. The physical thing, get your shoes on, get walking, and we'll see you in Luna Park in October.
Great.